That was the moment where Netanyahu could turn round to Israelis and say, you kept getting told that the world cared about the Palestinians, but we can't get away with it. This will rebound badly on us. Not only does the world not give a damn, the Arabs don't give a damn.
Welcome back to another episode of a brand new season of The Tea, the show where we dive into the story behind the stories. I'm your host, Myriam Francois. Before we get into this episode, I just want to take a tiny moment to ask you to do one thing for me, and that is to hit that subscribe button now. We're a small independent team, no big networks here, no corporate backing, just a handful of people who care deeply about having honest conversations and shining a light on what often goes unseen or unheard. So if our work does resonate with you too, then subscribe now on YouTube and join us on Patreon. Link in our bio. Starved, bombed, denied clean water and medicine, the airstrikes are just one of the methods being used to actively exterminate Palestinians in Gaza, who have no safe place to flee. And yet the international community has yet to send a peacekeeping force to protect Palestinians or even apply serious sanctions on Israel, despite its leadership having international arrest warrants out on them. Now, US officials have engaged in backchannel talks with Hamas, proposing extended ceasefires and prisoner exchanges, but this has so far only led to friction with Netanyahu's administration. In addition, the sacking of the US envoy who'd been sent to revive negotiations and who described Hamas as a quote-unquote bunch of nice guys doesn't bode well. A ceasefire agreement today seems like a distant hope, and yet without it, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in Gaza, a stated goal of Israel's leadership from the outset, is near inevitable. It's hard to overstate the dangers before us. To discuss this and much more, I'm joined by Daniel Levy, a British-Israeli analyst and former Israeli negotiator. As the president of the US Middle East Project and a co-founder of J Street, Daniel has worked for the Israeli government under the leadership of then Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Ehud Barak. And he's been involved in multiple peace initiatives, from the Oslo Accords to the Geneva Initiative. But not all peace is created equal, as the Palestinians well know. Let's dive into the realities of mediation, the challenges of diplomacy, and what it will take to achieve lasting peace in the region at this deeply troubled time. Daniel, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Good to be with you.
Daniel, I want to start off by asking you a little bit about your story, because not everyone will be familiar with you personally. They may have seen you, of course, on Al Jazeera, on the BBC and other networks. But tell me a little bit about your story. So you were born and raised in North London. You studied political science at King's College, Cambridge. And you then moved to Israel in the 1990s, where you serve as a non-commissioned officer in the IDF. Is that correct?
Correct.
I guess my first question, just because a lot of people get recruited from Cambridge into all sorts of places, was, did you get recruited by Mossad at Cambridge, Daniel?
This is the time to come clean, right? I've never been asked that, and I've never thought that, and maybe just no one's been as bold and brazen as to go there,
Dan.
Which I like. No.
Okay, so what was the story? How do you go from Cambridge grad, because you don't just become an officer, you then get involved in some of the highest level peace negotiations of your era, right? How does that happen?
It is pretty standard when you hit 16 to go on an Israel trip. Today, there's something called birthright trips, which are free trips, massively funded, massively scaled. Mm-hmm. This wasn't the case long ago when I did this trip. Mm-hmm. I then actually do a gap year.
Okay.
A chunk of which I spend in Israel, and I almost stay.
Okay.
Then.
Almost,
but there's a place at Cambridge waiting for me.
Okay.
I want to try and be true to my then self.
Yeah, of course.
Not my now self.
Right. No, that's right.
I grew up feeling very attached to my Jewish identity, but not very attached to the narrow confines of Jewish communal Britain, and trying to see things through the lens of, is it good or bad for the Jews when we're a small minority in this country? And the interest is surely what's best for this country. And if you wanted to see things through what's best for the Jewish people, well, there's a place that's trying to live that out in the contemporary world. And that place is Israel. I go there with, I guess I would self-define at that time as a liberal Zionist, as someone who's, yeah, I know a bit about the occupation. I know that something has to be resolved here. Israel is in flux. So my gap year is a little earlier. It's just before the outbreak of the first Intifada.
I was going to ask you about that.
I remember spending a weekend in Gaza. We were on a program at the university in Jerusalem, me and a friend, and we decided one Friday afternoon, we'll just get the last train out of Jerusalem Central Station. We get the last train out, the last bus. It takes us down to a southern community near Ashkelon. We hitch. I don't know what we had in mind. And we end up hitching with Palestinians who are going into Gaza, and we spend some time in Gaza that weekend. But I was aware of that. I felt I was on the right side because I believe that there should be two states and this occupation thing has to end. But I come back after the gap year. I live in the UK. There's a push factor as well.
Yeah.
This is still deep Thatcherite, seemingly endless conservative government Britain, and that's not a particularly dynamic, attractive place to be as far as I was concerned.
Yeah.
And flip side, Israel seemed like it was dynamic. So that's where I actually get elected. I get elected to be head of the World Union of Jewish Students.
What are you involved in at the time that makes you feel like this is a dynamic place that you want to invest in? Because obviously it might seem obvious to you, but, to me, I'm like, you're a North London boy, like the rest of us. Why are you drawn to go to this other place and invest your time and energy in that, even when you're aware, as you were at the time, that this is actually, a deeply problematic society, there's an occupation and all the rest of it. So I'm just curious,
and it feels like it's a society that might lend itself more to being shaped.
Okay,
again,
so you felt that there was potentiality.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to impute things to my younger self, but this was conscious. I spent parts of my first summer, I have to be careful because I was in that official position at the time, but I spent parts of my first summer there traveling around in the primary elections for the Labour Party list. At that time, there were two big parties.
Yeah.
With someone called Avram Borg. Mm-hmm. He actually comes kind of top of the primaries, doesn't get placed in cabinet. Mm-hmm. He goes on to become actually one of the more important dissident voices. He was the Speaker of Parliament. He has now written extensively on how Israel resembles Germany of the 1930s. He's the son of an important religious Zionist leader. Anyway, I spent the first summer going around with him.
Yeah.
And I kind of have a role in some of these institutional Jewish agency. I'm an ex officio on the board of the World Jewish Congress because we need some representation of young people. And it's about what educational services, what networking can we provide to these Jewish student groups around the world. And I'm sure there's a not insignificant element of here's what you need to know about Israel. There were arguments at the time. I have a big fight and I have funding withdrawn from the Jewish Agency because I invite someone called Ahmed Tibi to speak at the big world conference of the World Union of Jewish Students. He today is a Palestinian Israeli member of the Israeli parliament, member of the Knesset. At the time, this is before Israel has formally opened a dialogue with the PLO.
Yeah.
He is considered the guy closest to Arafat, the then leader of the PLO. There is not a great gaping, impossible to bridge contradiction between thinking, I'm here, I can do good, we can get a reasonable dispensation with the Palestinians, and me making good on my right of return under Israeli law is not at the expense of anyone else.
Okay.
That's what it feels like then.
How do you feel about that now?
What I was brought up, and I don't mean in my home, because it was a home that kind of had a Holocaust survivor element to it, and that really drew on the universalist ethic. Mm-hmm. But in a communal setting, that idea that what can be objectionable about the idea of a Jewish homeland. Everyone has a homeland, so why should we be the only ones not to have a homeland? And the truth is, the problem was that the other side, the Arabs, the Palestinians, they didn't accept partition. Mm-hmm. The deproblematicization of that idea,
yes,
that this is as natural and obvious and unobjectionable a thing as can be, is premised on ignoring why Palestinians would find that problematic. What was the cost to Palestinians of that thing that's supposed to be so unobjectionable? Why should Palestinians accept the partition of their land?
Right.
The honest early Zionists, and the one who I would say is the figure from which virtually all actual political Zionism today flows, which is Jabotinsky.
Yeah.
He's honest. He says no native people accepts their colonizer and doesn't resist. They resist. Mm. Now, there were other Zionists who tried to put a gloss on that and said, no, we're going to help them develop. It's for everyone's good. But there's a one sentence kind of, well, it's Jews have a right like anyone else of Zionism, but that you can't hold that without acknowledging that there is an actual existing Zionism in practice, which is the state ideology of a state that has not just as a one-off act, which in itself, of course, violated international law, wasn't acceptable, displaced Palestinians, but has pursued that endlessly over multiple decades. And therefore you have to the extent to which you had accepted in the first place, if you're going to be honest with yourself, you have to revisit that and ask, what does this mean? Where can we take this?
Well, it's also interesting, right, that there are many nations, many peoples, many nations who could make a claim to statehood who don't have states, right? It is not the case that every sort of people who think of themselves as a nation have a state. I mean, the Kurds would be the very obvious example of that, but they're not the only group.
And I always use, when people say, well, if you're against the state of Israel, you're an anti-Semite, I say, well, if anyone came forward and said, here are my reasons, I'm not saying these are my beliefs, but here are my reasons for opposing Kurdish statehood. Oh, you're an anti-Kurdish racist. I mean, it's pure nonsense.
We're currently at a time where the extremism in Israeli politics is so acute that it's almost difficult to remember that there was an era where there were talks that seemed to be aimed at achieving some kind of a lasting peace.
To acknowledge that there was a different era is not the same as suggesting that there was a goal. And that's...
Yeah. I mean, as you said, it was just after the first Intifada. It was far from a golden era for Palestinians.
But also this idea that somehow the original Nakba can be swept under the carpet, or the fact that after the Nakba, Palestinians who have not been expelled live under a military governorate inside so-called democratic Green Line Israel from 48 to 66. But acknowledging that doesn't mean that there wasn't a time where, and again here, we have to think about PLO then and PLO now, okay? That there wasn't a Palestinian national movement that had far more consensus than it does amongst Palestinians today.
I mean, clearly that's been one of the big efforts, has been the division of the Palestinian leadership.
Right, so I don't want, again, the PLO that endorses Oslo was not without its critics. It was not uncontroversial. The abandonment, as it was perceived, for good reasons, of the refugees.
The right to return.
The fact that much of the intellectual and parts of civil society and parts of the Palestinian diaspora were critical of that. But here was a movement which, had been the armed resistance, the PLO, had a certain claim to legitimacy, had a certain leadership that was recognized as such under Arafat, that went down that path. And it is a different reality today, and that doesn't mean that one glosses over the problematic nature of what it was then.
No, and I think that's a really important point to raise, because I do think it is possible now to look back at that era with slightly rose-tinted eyes, because the idea of there being a singular leader who's, the lead negotiator, regardless of the fact that we know that there were contested views around even Arafat, however unifying he may have been, There is no such equivalent today. Clearly not in the figure of Mahmoud Abbas. But before we circle back to that, so how do you end up this non-commissioned officer in the IDF?
As someone who takes up the possibility of Israeli citizenship, as I did, as is an option accorded to any Jew in the world under something called the law of return. You, depending on what age you do that, you are, as Israelis are, automatically conscripted to the IDF. The age at which I did it, that meant a year. I do grunt basic training. I do that in a military camp just outside of Nablus. I'm with some other older kids, mostly Russian and Ethiopian, actually, given the demographics of where people are moving to Israel from at the time that I moved in the early 90s, or by then it's close to the mid-90s, by the time I get drafted, and with 18-year-old Israelis. And I'm sitting on the bus going to this training camp in Nablus, and I'm like, well, this is a bit curious. I'm in occupied territory. You know what? If someone has a pop, that's legitimate. We are a legitimate target.
You thought that to yourself as you were going to IDF training? As
I'm on the bus going, I'm sitting there thinking,
in the 90s.
I wouldn't be, because that's the reality of it. Palestinians do have a right. Israel is an occupying army in Palestinian territory.
It doesn't make you an obvious candidate to be recruited by the IDF as one of their chief negotiators, though, does it?
No, it doesn't. But I also want to clarify. In my military service, I then get put in a unit which does liaison with neighboring armies with whom Israel is at peace. So that's Egypt and Jordan, with the UN forces stationed, and with any foreign armies to Israel. Halfway through that, my commanding officer gets put onto the Oslo talks, and I get put onto into that delegation. Then I'm doing it as part of my military service. Okay. That's in the Oslo B talks under Rabin. I finish my military service literally the day before he gets assassinated in November of 1995. And for people
who don't have a sense of...
So I'm not a chief negotiator. I want to say
well, okay. Key negotiator, important negotiator?
Not then. Later on, I'm part of a much smaller negotiating team, and that's a political choice.
And so what were the qualities that you think they identified in you that made you such an asset in a negotiation?
I don't think I was. I think, look, in the early time, it was a big negotiating team, and it was about... I've gone to Cambridge. I can draft, even as a non-lawyer.
Yes.
Quite good English. I guess it was in Israel 30 years ago, which looks different also in those ways to how it looks today. Later on, I'm simply there because this is towards the end of the Ehud Barak premiership in the negotiations in Taba. Because the politician I am then working with, who was the justice minister at the time, Yossi Beilin, is put as one of a cohort of a handful of ministers who are running those negotiations. And so, as his senior advisor, I'm part of.
You become part of that. Yeah. So let me ask you this. So you obviously describe yourself as a lifelong peace advocate, and I think even the organization that you joined when you were younger, I could see there was a lot of work being done supporting different liberation movements throughout the world. And I think it's only in the 90s that it sort of shifts towards a kind of pro-Zionist perspective, which I think is really interesting when you look at their history as an organization. The youth group that you'd been involved in. I was just wondering, so when you move to Israel and you're serving in the IDF and it's, close to the end of the First Intifada, you are presumably witness to widespread use of violence against Palestinians, right? I'm thinking, the Human Rights Watch reports from 92 that already document widespread use of torture on Palestinians by Israel's General Security Service, so the Shin Bet. As well as mass home demolitions, use of live ammunition on Palestinian kids, sweeping curfews. So you're aware of this wider environment. You go into that thinking your role within that is what exactly?
I think the awareness is less.
Okay.
When one is there.
Less of the violence? Less aware of the violence?
I think so. I do. It's still the Intifada, but it's towards the tail end of the Intifada. I arrive within a short amount of time is the 92 election where Labour comes to power and a back channel is established with the PLO. Yeah, it's an election which it's hard to compute today, but and for all his shortcomings, and those are legion, Rabin runs on a platform of money for working class communities, not for settlements. That's his platform. Israel is wasting money on settlements.
Okay.
The Meretz party, which is about as left a Jewish Zionist party as it gets, and they were more left then than they are now, wins 12 seats. And this is openly an anti-occupation party, a language that one does not hear from any Zionist party, including the legacy representatives of today's Meretz. So they get into power. And there is a deal in relatively short order with the PLO. Now, again, there were those who at the time, I think, correctly criticized the fact that this kind of a partial deal was made.
Yeah.
I then get involved in track 2 talks with the Palestinians, with the people who had negotiated Oslo. And that's when I get exposed in a deep way to Palestinian realities.
Okay.
I'd spent time as a student with people when I was in the UK with people from GUPS. I had informal relations, the General Union of Palestine Students. But when I'm there, I develop kind of, you have a meeting, but then sometimes you stick around and you spend time and you do a much deeper dive.
Yeah.
I then go and do my year's army service, having done that already.
Yeah.
First time I turn up to the negotiations, I'm in civvies, in civilian clothing, because that's how we dressed for those negotiations. And it's the first time members of the Israeli team have seen me, and I know a bunch of the Palestinians. Okay. Because of our informal talks. And they're like, which side is this guy on?
So you were seen as a bridge within these
I don't know if I was seen as a bridge. I was too young to act as that.
Yeah.
But I'm processing.
So let me ask you this, because I've asked this question of many of my Jewish friends who've spoken out critically on Israel. Many of them have lost close relationships, friendship groups. In some cases, they've been completely ostracized by their wider community. It seems there's a price Jews who criticize Israel are made to pay. How has your life been impacted? Because you're pretty vocal on this stuff. And you're also, from our personal conversations, a practicing Jew, right? I'm not. Not a secular Jewish
I'm more
person.
secular than I was brought up with.
Yeah.
It's harder to find those spaces.
Yeah.
As my friend Peter Beinart has written in his book, Being Jewish After Gaza.
Yes.
He said it's perfectly acceptable in the Jewish world today to in the diaspora to go into a synagogue and delegitimize God, but you can't go into a synagogue and delegitimize Israel, which is a remarkable place to have reached. I feel that the depth of my connection in Israel, and there's the community of people who, from my time there, or who even since I've left, I've kind of gotten to know, who I have huge respect for, who are, I think the correct word is probably dissident, who are that dissident community of Jewish Israelis, who are, some of whom have put their bodies on the line, their well-being on the line, their careers on the line. There's another community of people who haven't gone on that journey, of my Jewish Israeli friends.
Yeah.
But most of them I can still engage with, some not.
Yeah, you're still able to maintain.
And you know what I find really, and I keep reflecting on this, and I'm not sure where to go with it even, Myriam, is they're more interested in the last 18 months, since October 7th and what's happened subsequent to October 7th. They're more interested in my critique. They know, many of these guys know something has fundamentally gone wrong here. And these are one of the other factors is these are people who have, many of them have done well,
right,
who've thrived in Israeli Hebrew culture. They're
Yes.
not people, they're not the kinds who could up sticks and do well anywhere in the world because, whether they're in media or creative industries, they live in that language.
it's a small pond. Yeah,
It is a very small pond.
Yeah.
And, they're people who are now saying, I don't know, I'm taking out that second passport. I'm looking at what my options are. I don't know if I can continue to bring my kids up here.
Yeah.
What was that critique you had? What is it you think is more fundamentally wrong than we're being told here?
Let me ask you about that, because I do think that the radicalization of Israeli society is something that it seems from the outside there's not sufficient introspection on, when it comes to Israelis themselves. And of course, we now know that as a consequence in many ways of that lack of introspection, UK youth, a striking 54% today believe that Israel shouldn't exist. Only 25% disagree with that. We have seen the most deranged behavior from Israelis. And I'm not just even talking soldiers. We've seen deranged behavior from soldiers, but we've seen deranged mothers on TikTok dressing up their children, with black eyes and missing teeth, or making fun of parents losing babies. We've seen soldiers urinating on Palestinian captives, children attacked by dogs, sexual assault, rape. At a certain point, are Israelis aware that public perception today of Israel is of a deeply depraved society? I mean, you can put all the Hasbro spin that you want on this. There is no putting lipstick on a pig. I mean, this one is, there is no rollback. And I think what's particularly complicated is the lack of introspection that we are not seeing from Israelis. It's just, everyone's anti-Semitic, everyone hates the Jews. Really? You think that's why people hate Israel today? And so I want to ask you, for those of us who are looking at Israeli society, this is looking psychotic. This was a society that was once aspirational to you. How are you reading it today?
So the perhaps easiest, most hopeful go-to place is that societies can go through such horrendous periods and come out the other side and heal. Mm-hmm. But there's an awful lot to unpack before one can even allow oneself that easy path. Israeli Jewish society, because of course 20% of Israeli citizens are Palestinian citizens of Israel. Israeli Jewish society has lived certain trauma, but has been educated to carry trauma with it. In other words, it's almost like the further one goes from the Holocaust, the more one is pulled back into re-experiencing that, having everything refracted through that lens, including the fact that at least 50% of the Jewish community in Israel didn't experience that 3 generations ago because they came from Arab states in the region, Iran, where there wasn't a history of Christian anti-Semitism that fed into, so there is manufactured trauma as well. It matters that for a generation, pretty much, the right has been in control of the education ministry. That, we don't take those things seriously enough, but that matters over time.
Yeah.
It matters that in a supposedly free media, not only do you have censorship, but more consequential, you have self-censorship and you have mobilization. Much of the Israeli media acts as an inciter to genocide. This is Radio Rwanda of the 1990s in that genocide on steroids. It matters hugely that we have built layer upon layer of dehumanization of Palestinians inside Israeli society. But maybe it matters most that they have gotten away with it. On the micro level, for every potential conversation with someone on the outside who said, guys, there is a validator. an American validator, a European political validator, a Western media establishment validator.
An enabler.
It matters that so many world leaders have adopted the Israeli narrative, that criticism of Israel's criminal actions, genocidal actions, is merely mouthed.
Right.
I just saw Emmanuel Macron speaking, and I'm like, finally, he's not attributed enough to the Israeli side that he should, but he spoke about Palestinians in human terms. We don't even have that most of the time.
No, we do not.
So on that micro level, they have multiple go-to places where they can say, no, it's okay. We have our validators. Of course, there has been this attempt to redefine anti-Semitism.
Yes.
Which I won't go into in depth here, but that is an important piece of it.
Yes.
And then if I go to the macro level, it's the impunity at a state level. Unchecked impunity leads to unchecked extremism. You see, I don't believe that Israeli society can be bludgeoned and sanctioned into crumbling and deoccupying, ending apartheid. I believe it can be held accountable and have its incentive structure shifted in such a way that it opens up a new conversation. Because we know how that plays out. The way that plays out is people initially say, well, what do you expect from those bloody anti-Semites? Oh, this is, of course they shouldn't do that, of course. And they go, this is really inconvenient. And then they go, actually, this is impacting my life. And then you begin to ask a whole different set of questions. But Israeli society has grown so used to being able to get away with anything.
Right.
And the last thing I'd say on this is, do not underestimate how much of a pinnacle, how much of a cherry on the topping of that process of normalizing the abnormal in terms of a system of apartheid and structural violence against Palestinians, how crucial were the Abraham Accords. Because that was the moment where Netanyahu could turn round to Israelis and say, you kept getting told that the world cared about the Palestinians, but we can't get away with it, that this will rebound badly on us. Not only does the world not give a damn, the Arabs don't give a damn.
Right.
Bang.
So I think I've heard you say previously that the normalization with Israel by Arab states was the single worst move that could have been done for Palestinian liberation. And I'm paraphrasing you now. Do you stand by that today? Do you regard the normalization? At the moment, obviously, we're talking about, let's be frank, the UAE normalization deal with Israel, but which obviously we know is part of a wider regional precedent that was set and which is now set to be expanded in all likelihood, regardless of anything, to Saudi Arabia, which is desperate for this Israeli normalization deal. Why would you consider that to be the worst thing to have happened to the Palestinians, this normalization deal?
Two caveats. I'm going to caveat
Please
what
do.
you said on Saudi.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure.
Yes, I know. We disagree on this one slightly.
So we'll park that. I'm not saying it can't happen.
No, yeah.
But I think there's a higher bar there.
Yeah.
The other caveat is, as long as we're talking about the worst things that happened to Palestinians outside
of their ethnic cleansing and ongoing genocide.
Exactly.
Yes, sure.
And
yes.
Outside of their own leadership's missteps. And by that, I don't mean what is often the narrative of the Palestinians should have done more to ingratiate themselves with Israel.
Yes.
What I mean here is the division, the fact that a quarter of a century after the expiration of the Oslo Accords, which were due to end in May of 1999, you have a Palestinian leadership that continues to run a Palestinian authority, which is an adjunct to the Israeli occupation and its security forces.
Indeed.
That is, okay, so parking all of that. The reason I say that is precisely what the impact of the Abraham Accords is precisely what I just said. That was the victory of the Netanyahu narrative.
Right.
You had competing narratives in Israel. Those competing narratives were not around the rights of Palestinians. Those competing narratives were around what can we get away with. So there wasn't, there was a fight in the 90s, in the early 90s of, can we actually talk about Palestinians? And the fight that won, the side that won on the center left was those who said, listen, the way we can win this argument with our public, and for many of them this is what they actually believed in, the way we can win this argument is we tell them two things. Number one, there's a demographic threat. Like if you don't impose a border, then
we're going to be swamped.
We're going to be swamped.
Never
now,
heard
of
that
course,
one before.
right.
Yeah.
So as soon as you're in that, you're on that demographic track, you're way down the road of dehumanization, right? So if that's the counterpoint to the right, you're really not in a great place, which is why I say everyone's now the descendants of Jabotinsky. There is no other tradition that one can draw upon.
Yes.
The second thing they said is, whatever we'd like to do with the Palestinians, we won't be able to get away with it.
Because the Arabs will not allow it.
And the world wouldn't.
Yes, starting surely with the neighbors, though, we would have expected maybe.
Well, exactly. So if you do not have an effective, strategic, sufficiently unified Palestinian liberation project, and you do not have frontline states, and you have a West that is pre-programmed as a set of countries that were colonial countries, that are settler colonial countries, that are pre-programmed and also have the guilt to go along with Israel, then you're left with a smattering in the global South. Which is not nothing.
No.
Even there, I want to... so, okay, that's how we got to where we are.
The Tea is a fully independent, non-partisan production. No corporate ties here, just a small, dedicated team working hard to bring you honest, impactful conversations. If you believe in our work, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click on that subscribe button now and join us as a Patreon. You'll find the link in our bio. There used to be a degree of sympathy for something called liberal Zionism, right? The liberal Zionists were sort of those who, probably closer to what you described that you were drawn to in Israel initially, the idea of a two-state solution, of some kind of negotiated peace settlement with the Palestinians, at least a recognition of a Palestinian state. But that today there really is... I've seen many people talk about the idea that there's no moral ground left for liberal Zionists. What leg are you standing on? And so I guess, first of all, I wanted to ask you about a quote in 2008 in an article in The Atlantic where you were asked, are you a liberal Zionist? And at the time you answered yes. And I don't know if you have a different response to that today. Obviously it's interesting to hear either way. But whatever your answer is, I'd like you to kind of bring it into a discussion of this view that there is no ground left for for liberal Zionism to stand on, that the moral sort of high ground that it had previously has withered away, because within the extremes that we find ourselves, that liberal Zionism has stood with fascistic Zionism and continued to advocate for the ongoing violence. So where do you stand today on sort of the liberal Zionist position, which has always been painted as sort of Zionism light, that maybe the middle grounders, the ones that we can negotiate with, but today many of whom are still backing genocide? So
there's a lot to unpack there. I think that interview was with Jeffrey Goldberg of
it may have been
Signalgate, recent fame.
It was in The Atlantic. Yes, that's correct. Yes. I think, you said at the time he said you were asked if you were a Zionist, and you said the answer is a yes, albeit a more complex yes than I'd like it to be.
And now it's a no, albeit a more complex no than a two-letter word.
Yeah.
And one can come at this from a couple of places. One is Israel is an established reality, therefore better a liberal version of it than a different version of it. But
a liberal version of an apartheid state?
So there's the but. I don't know if there was ever a moment where two states could have segued into something that was non-apartheid that could still be called Zionist. I don't know. Even today,
yes.
I'll come back to it.
Yes.
But even today, there's an open question as to the future use of that terminology.
Totally. Can I just segue briefly? Professor Barnett Rubin, who I respect immensely, and he and I have discussed this repeatedly. And he says to me, there is, of course, a version of Zionism that does not require stealing people's lands. It means you go to the land and you either rent or you buy, but you don't try and impose, your state on these people. You recognize it's where they're living and you either integrate or you stay a while and you go, but you don't the idea that it requires the establishment of a militaristic society and state and the expulsion of the indigenous people is wild. He's like, there's no reason that Zionism had to include that.
Yes, but I don't want to be so easy on reality,
of course,
or even on myself of 2008. Okay, because the accumulated burden of proof, body of proof, by then and long before then, was that whatever nice ideas of non-statist Zionism, of cultural, of binational, had long since, not been relevant to the world in which we live. And so I think the argument then was, in the absence of anything else, can there be, first of all, an end to occupation? I think that's how some of us, I probably would count myself amongst them.
Yeah.
And that's where the answer, I guess, was a bit more complex than I'd like it to be.
Because also when you say into the occupation, you're still talking about 1967 borders.
Right.
You're still talking about two
exactly.
states.
So in that context, I am.
Yes.
And now we'll go somewhere else in a second.
Yeah.
But the idea that the best outcome one could imagine would be end to the 67 occupation. And then how does one address the nature of the regime on the Israeli side of the newly established divide?
To avoid a Jewish supremacist state that is apartheid-like because it affords differential rights to Jews and non-Jews.
Exactly. And then you'd be talking about inside the 67 lines, not
not what would be the Palestinian territories.
Yes. However, you do not have anyone advocating from the perspective of political Zionism, political parties who define as Zionist. You do not have anyone advocating for anything that approximates actual sovereign Palestinian statehood and deoccupation.
Right.
And therefore, if people say, oh, but there's no other option, well, two states isn't an option either, because the two-state option that's on offer, that's talked about in Israel, is apartheid. Now, you now have apartheidists against genocidists, which isn't a small thing, the difference between the two, given what's going on in Gaza. But it's not like one wants to align with or sees a bright future with the apartheidists. So I think where we are is there are four possible outcomes at the moment.
Yeah.
Two of those are zero-sum, and we are in a zero-sum space. And we seem to right now be on a race between can Israel kill, forcibly displace, ethnically cleanse sufficient Palestinians for what I call the victory camp, the apartheid is not enough camp, because you still have Palestinians, for them to create an irreversible reality. One. Or a race where Israeli society implodes. Now that, for most people, would say, what has he been smoking this morning? That doesn't look like it's going to happen. This isn't about Israeli society unraveling because there are a significant cohort of bleeding hearts who just can't stand to watch what we're doing for the Palestinians. They're my dissident minority friends.
Right.
And others, but they're a distant minority. But what you have is a society that is deeply polarized around, but this was supposed to at least be a democracy for me. as an Israeli Jewish person. And now you're fundamentally changing the rules of those games. And am I really going to be asked to serve yet another round of reserve duty just to endorse the political needs of Netanyahu or Ben-Gvir or Smotrich? No love lost for Palestinians, but do I want to spend my time loading them on trucks, etc.? So these divisions inside Israeli society. So those are two possible outcomes.
Although the most recent poll we could find, which was of March this year, showed that nearly 3 in 5 Israelis, 60%, back Israel going back to war in Gaza.
What you have is an Israel that does have vulnerabilities, that does have Achilles' heels. That internal polarization is one.
Yeah.
The economy, it doesn't run a resistance economy, is one.
Yes.
The fact that they don't have an endless supply of reservists is one.
Yeah.
So those are two possible outcomes.
Yeah.
I think there are two other possible outcomes. The one that still gets all the diplomatic limelight is, can't we just go back to 2 states?
Yeah.
We've spoken about that. What are its shortcomings? The fact that there's no one there, and then there's another outcome, which is you have equal rights for all those who live on the land. Now that also requires an understanding that, as Rashid Khalidi says, who's a Palestinian. Just retired as a professor of Columbia, which is now quite estranged, and author and historian. As he says, despite its settler colonial origins, Israeli Jews are now a permanent national community. So I really think this is a question. Are we talking about removing the supremacist regime? Because this isn't about Israel's right to exist. It's for an awfully long time become about Israel's right to dominate other people. It doesn't have that right.
Yeah.
But are we talking about the physical removal of the Israeli Jewish community?
Yeah.
I don't think so, nor would I endorse that. And therefore, a Palestinian future of non-partition, a Palestinian future of removal of those structures of apartheid, and worse, has to come to grips with, as the ANC did, without wanting to over-romanticize or draw upon the South African example, as the ANC did in its Freedom Charter, has to say, you have a different way to live here. We're not saying you're not going to live here.
Yeah.
You can live here, but not as the tip of the spear of an ethno-nationalist supremacist regime. And in that respect, to circle all the way back, in that respect, why do those divisions in the Zionist camp, even if they don't translate into much today for Palestinians, why do those divisions matter? Those divisions matter because if one is serious about power, and at the end of the day, this isn't winning a debate. This isn't who looks better on TikTok. We have to understand, liberation is about structures of power. And if you want to pull on threads that undo structures of power, that play in those rifts and tensions in the dominant power class of the Zionist elite. If the liberal Zionists, they're not going to go with you on that whole journey of emancipation, but maybe they can be useful for achieving this, which then further unravels Israeli society. And one has to be thinking as hard as it is in those terms. And I would argue that today, and people legitimately will say to me, that was always the case. You just a slow learner. That today, non-partition has to be front and center. And I've just been looking back on, for instance, the Indian position. In 1947, when the UN establishes an internal commission, UNSCOP, to look into what will happen with the mandatory Palestine as the British announced they're going to withdraw, India advocates for a federation, not a partition. India votes against partition. India votes against Israel joining the UN. And India has just gone through, of course, its own decolonization and partition and separation into what now increasingly looks like an ethno-national state on the Indian side as well.
Interesting. I guess, the counter to that is, and I hear you on all fronts, is obviously that the reality of a one state today is of an Israeli state, not a Palestinian state. I mean, I'd be the first to, not want to articulate that publicly for all the obvious reasons. But it seems to me that if we talk about a one state today, it won't be a Palestinian state. It'll be an Israeli state. And so I'm just very curious as to how people who are supportive of, Palestinian liberation, statehood, kind of find a way around the reality of advocating for, what I think looks like the only plausible reality from where we're sitting today, right? There's no two territories. There is no two territories. The mass expansion of Israeli settlements into the West Bank, the decimation of Gaza means that in reality, there have been decade-long successful attempts to create a reality on the ground that belies the possibility of any two states, even when you float some of the most ridiculous arguments which we'd heard at the time, including things like, we can have an air bridge or a tunnel that connects the West Bank to Gaza. Ludicrous, absolutely ludicrous suggestions in the first instance, never serious. And in the meantime of all these discussions, the reality on the ground is that there is no space today, really, because what's been created are more like Bandustans that are more and more isolated from one another in the region. So, I hear you on the one state, but I just struggle, I guess, to understand how that would translate in a Palestinian state as opposed to potentially a non-apartheid Israeli state. But there'd be a lot of work, obviously, between now and then. We haven't got much time left, but I do want to ask you very quickly, if we can, to tell me your thoughts on these very common myths that we hear floated online. So think of it as like a quick fire round.
So can the first quick fire be this non-partition? At the moment, we have one state. We have one state that is an apartheid state, but there is an attempt now to turn that into an increasingly ethnically pure state by removing Palestinians. So what one is talking about is overturning that.
Right. In the first
I don't want to
instance.
interrupt your quick fire round.
Yes, no, so quick fire round. As somebody who has been deeply involved in peace negotiations, the claim that Palestinians have been the main obstruction to peace deals. True or false, Daniel?
False, because Israel, as the occupying power, the asymmetry of power there is staggering. If Israel wanted a peace deal, it would be achieved in incredibly short order. Israel has never come to terms with the fact that it's not negotiating with itself, it's not negotiating with Palestine, it's not negotiating with Americans. It needs to negotiate with Palestinians and come to terms with Palestinians. There were things that we were never allowed to bring up, transitional justice, all these kinds of things, truth and reconciliation, because Israel unfortunately does not want to deal with those things. So it's constantly in a negotiation with itself.
Claim number 2, there is no partner for peace on the Palestinian side.
I wish the partner for peace on the Palestinian side was also a partner for strategically challenging the status quo, because what you have had is a Palestinian national movement which accepted not the 1947 partition of 50-50, but the reality created by Israel of 78-22, and then continued to agree to negotiate itself back from that, which led to an Israel that believed it could get away with anything, that there was no red line. And I don't think that was good for Israelis either. We now have a situation where you need to respect your adversary in a conflict. And if the adversary is the PA, which is doing the dirty work of security for you, not representing its own people, not unifying its ranks, not challenging the status quo, then the only way in which there's no Palestinian partner for peace argument is true is there's no Palestinian partner for creating the conditions for peace, because there's no Palestinian national liberation movement to challenge Israel, which is what needs to happen. Why? Because there's no Israeli partner for peace, and there will only be an Israeli partner for peace if the Israelis see that the other options are not good for them. A divided, unstrategic, co-opted Palestinian movement can't do those things, sadly.
Some might argue that strategic force has been Hamas. Daniel, do you condemn Hamas?
I condemn any violation of international law.
It was a Piers Morgan gag, by the way, but you could go for real with it.
What was it? Oh, was it? Okay, sorry.
It's all good.
I'm not familiar enough with his oeuvre
I saw
of
you
work.
take it a little too serious, and I was like, no, this is not even a real question,
So
because
listen,
you and I both know.
But my real answer is
yes.
Palestinians have the right, in fact, the responsibility under international law to defend themselves against a belligerent and now ICJ declared illegal hostile occupation that uses structural violence against them. They should do that within the confines of international law, just as Israel has to, and of course serially does not act within international law. You need the resistance movement on the inside. I don't know of a liberation struggle that doesn't have an armed resistance movement.
Yeah.
There is no such thing as demilitarization absent addressing the root causes of the conflict, withdrawing of the structural violence targeting Palestinians.
Yeah.
At the moment, de facto, Hamas is the only negotiating partner, but Hamas themselves would be the first ones to tell you, we want this to be part of a broader national movement. Hamas has consistently said yes to reconciliation talks, to elections,
to the ceasefire deal.
Well, the ceasefire deal is a whole different thing, but yes, to that as well, or to a reasonable set of terms for the ceasefire deal. This is where the Palestinian political house needs to be put in order, which isn't something I can do.
No. Let me ask you, there is a case going through the British courts now looking to overturn the proscription of Hamas as a terrorist organization in the UK on the basis this case is bringing that the apartheid regime in Israel is obviously a violent occupation which requires the protection of the Palestinian people. And so what is considered to be terrorism, they would argue, are measures designed to protect their people. That case is being brought. It'll go through the British courts. Do you think it's helpful for Hamas to be a proscribed organization? Does it being labeled a terrorist group help us? I'm thinking particularly as a negotiator right now, like what advantages do we gain from Hamas being called a terrorist organization? Or does it just make what is an inevitable eventual dialogue more complicated?
Yeah, I don't see where one could find advantages other than if you want to use that designation to criminalize people domestically and to use that as part of the sharp end of the push against civil liberties in the UK. Otherwise, it certainly as a conflict resolution tool, as a ceasefire advancement tool, as something that can help with peace negotiations, it is of course totally counterproductive, and it's not designed, I think, in that way. But I kind of have no patience for the entire terrorist designation industry. It is a political thing. There is international law. Israel is violating international law. Are you going to call that a terror state? If you're in the business of conflict resolution, you get in the room with states who are doing things that they shouldn't be doing. You get in the room with armed resistance movements who are doing things also that they shouldn't be doing, and you try and work that through. You don't play this game of designation. I mean, if you remember, the Americans basically said to Sudan, we'll take you off the list of state sponsors of terror if you normalize with Israel. That's how serious this stuff is, not at all.
And what are your thoughts on Adam Boehler, who obviously didn't last very long after being sent to actually negotiate directly with Hamas's description? He said on CNN, look, they don't have horns growing out of their heads. They're actually guys like us. They're quite nice.
Yeah, the amazing thing is that Boehler comes out of that and he does these interviews. And I think that's why the Israelis really got spooked by it. He went and did 3 interviews on Israeli news channels.
Yes.
Israeli news channels. To maintain one of the many big lies, which is the obstacle is Hamas, not us, Israel has to make sure that the other interlocutors are not in the room with Hamas. Because if it's only Egypt and Qatar as the mediators, then people say, but can we trust what they're telling us, etc.
Right.
And Boehler's in the room, and Boehler actually starts to use Hamas framing because... Not because he gets taken in by the beautiful blue eyes of the
Hamas
not
Stockholm
negotiators.
Syndrome.
It's not Stockholm Syndrome. It's because their position is more reasonable and they offer a long-term hudna, and this is the actual way you can get a ceasefire.
So hudna,
and what the
ceasefire, yeah.
Hudna, and that's what Israel is offering does not ever get you there. So the issue here all along has been that Israel does not have a position where there is any sustainable ceasefire, where Israel withdraws from the Gaza Strip, where Gaza is made whole, etc., because it wants a perpetual war. And if I can say two things, it's part of a broader project. Number one, as far as Israel is concerned, if you listen to the Israeli prime minister, he will talk about Azatim, Gazans. He will talk about Toshvei Yehuda v'Shomron, residents of Judea and Samaria. He will talk about
West Bank,
B'nai Miut, the minorities inside Israel. There's never Palestinians because you can't accept this Palestinian whole. You have to break it down to manageable and vanquishable chunks of other things.
Divide and conquer.
And now what they're trying to do is make Gaza uninhabitable, including by seizing parts of that territory, because that's part of this irreversible so-called permanent victory plan, which they will not succeed in, is your view.
So let's talk about this kind of the official narrative is that there's this war that, Israel just needs to finish, that Hamas is the reason, and that Israel is just being supported by their American ally against these evil terrorists. What's actually going on, Dan?
Many of my Israeli friends attended funerals in the days following October 7th. People will probably be familiar that some of those people in those communities that were most impacted in Gaza, Vivian Silva, others, were people who were committed to something that isn't what Israel is doing now, what Israel had been doing for decades. So the crimes that were committed on October 7th are real. The crimes that Israel committed every day for decades, the abnormality of a Palestinian life under Israeli structural violence and illegal belligerent occupation, without which, it's not about justifying, but without which one cannot understand October 7th, are the thing that was allowed to fester. You didn't have that, you wouldn't have had October 7th.
What Sinwar called in an interview a few years ago the slow genocide of Gaza. So he argued that they were being killed slowly. Now it's happening fast, but prior to October the 7th, his view was that was happening slowly, just at a slower rate.
And I think this is where you have an Israel that was primed, given everything we've discussed and everything that went before, to respond in the way it did. And you had also Palestinians who, even if they believed what had gone on, because of course people are not only programmed not to believe that if they see a violation from their side, but also if they accepted that this isn't something that they were comfortable with, would still say, I don't want my people to live on their knees and die slowly on their knees.
Right.
But also, it didn't help that Israel methodically lied about what happened on October 7th. I believe October 7th was bad enough without having to make up stories, which they still today make up, and many Western media establishments bought those, and many Western politicians
You're referring to things like
those.
the 40 beheaded babies mythology.
You actually had one Israeli journalist who showed a series of the lies and debunked them. Raviv Durka, who's one of the only people who's challenged the mainstream narrative from within a mainstream Israeli media outlet. Okay. Israel announces on day one, not that it will seek to hold those who took the actions responsible and to release the Israelis being held. It announces on day one, the first thing it does is it announces we are going to violate international law and we are going to create the conditions for what has now become the enactment of an attempted genocide, because we are going to collectively punish, and this is what the Israelis say, we will stop food, fuel, water and electricity. into Gaza, and then they indiscriminately bomb Gaza. So Israel has conducted an operation which should have been challenged very early on.
But what is the purpose of that operation? Is it as you say, revenge for October the 7th?
Much more.
Right. What's the real purpose of what Netanyahu is doing here?
So I think one has to kind of layer it.
Yeah.
All right. There's a piece of this which is Netanyahu was staring into the abyss in terms of his personal political future. He's a prime minister who, when he's not busy creating the conditions for genocide, is busy defending himself in a courtroom.
Right. And could end up in prison.
The precedents exist for prime ministers, for presidents. Okay. So and he's now a prime minister who has been in charge during this devastating moment and huge failure for Israel. He has to somehow stabilize his politics and the possibility of a return to political viability and salience for himself. And he latches upon the idea that this is a society programmed now to be vengeful, and if I can be a relatively successful and long-term war leader, we also kick into the deep grass, needing to deal with what happened, commissions of inquiry, all that kind of stuff, and I would have time to turn it round. And he does. And he is, of course, operating against a backdrop of everything we've talked about, which is broader Israeli goals with regard to the Palestinians. And he has within his coalition people for whom this isn't just about creating the conditions for maximum harm to the Palestinians. This is about removal and resettlement of Gaza and setting the example for the West Bank. And in the last few months, we've seen that now playing out in terms of the devastation, also of infrastructure, of refugee camps, the displacement of over 40,000 Palestinians in the West Bank. Netanyahu proudly stands at the podium of the Knesset earlier in March, and he says, this is our most extensive operation in, he calls it Judea and Samaria, since 1967. So there is a much bigger political project, but a political project that can only be sustained with the backing of the outside. And as the evidence of the violations of international law, as the evidence of the horrendous crimes being visited upon Palestinians becomes ever more concrete, ever more grotesque, the support continues. Biden is I don't know whether at some stages they thought they wanted a ceasefire. I can't speak to that. Fact, they continue arming, enabling, abetting, politically, diplomatically, economically supporting Israel. And Trump just doubles down on that with the one caveat of maybe he sees some benefits in a ceasefire. We'll see where that goes.
So do you have hope right at the moment that we're speaking right now that a ceasefire could be on the cards?
I mostly don't. And I think this is all pretty...
very painful to hear, but I mean,
that's and this is
sense.
pretty transparent. This is what people reluctant to acknowledge. The Hamas position, which is, yes, but as long as it's an actual ceasefire and the IDF withdraws from Gaza, that was actually the position of the Biden administration. That is the reasonable position, and that's the position which Israel is standing up against. The one, being possible positive thing, is Trump. If he wants to do it, Netanyahu can't manage and bully Trump in the way that he so easily could with Biden. The other, maybe, is they haven't defeated the resistance movement, but they haven't defeated the Palestinian people and the resilience of the Palestinian people. And the third, which is why I don't think that as horrendous as this is, the goal of so-called total victory, which is total evisceration and physical removal, is this question of the vulnerabilities inside Israeli society around this.
Last point then, if you were advising the US or the UK government on this right now, what would you be advising them to do at this point that they're not already doing?
Well, none of the things they're doing are helpful. So I honestly, what I'd say is, don't waste your time thinking what one could advise the US and the UK government. We have to understand the balance of forces, the nature of the different actors, the nature of the moment we are in. When it comes to the US and the UK, I think it is about building broad front coalitions in civil society and politically with relatively non-maximalist demands of those governments, because they're going to be the last governments who do the right thing. What I want from them is to mitigate some of their criminal involvement in what is going on. Because, I can give you chapter and verse of what I'd like them to do, and it doesn't matter, because one has to understand the nature of the different actors. And, that's why I would encourage a politics that is painfully embedded in the realities of the moment. This isn't about purity tests. This is about, can one in any way impact through legal strategies, through coalitions that are built, not that much through shaming, because I think we're in something of a post-shame environment.
Yeah.
The kinds of weaponry, the kinds of backing, the kinds of pressure on third countries. So when I'm thinking about it, my goal in those centers of Western power is damage mitigation and limitation. My goals elsewhere are to make progress to try and challenge both those Western centers, to have other third-party actors, and to challenge Israel directly. If I'm going to end with a South Africa analogy, the success of putting under a microscope that we cannot have normal relations with an abnormal regime was not led by those governments. They were not only latecomers, they were lastcomers to doing this. This was led by popular movements. We have the conditions now where more can be done with popular movements. We really miss having a central vector that is a Palestinian national movement that has a vision, that has a strategy, that understands that you have comrades on the Jewish-Israeli side, but you also have allies for limited achievement of goals, and you need to offer them a vision, and you need to build this capacity in frontline states. You need to use what you have in the global majority, global South, where people do see the inequities of their own history reflected in what is happening to Palestinians and how that is treated internationally. And we're desperately in need of that strategy. But in the absence of it, one does the bits that one can.
Fair enough. Daniel Levy, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. Appreciate your time.
Pleasure. Really nice to speak to you.
And thank you all for tuning in. Now, these aren't easy conversations, but they are necessary ones, and we're grateful you're walking through them with us. At the T, we're committed to challenging the narratives that uphold injustice and amplifying those speaking to truth to power, even when it's inconvenient. Especially when it's inconvenient. If that resonates with you, consider subscribing, sharing this episode, or supporting us on Patreon to help keep this space alive. Until next time, stay grounded, stay bold, and as always, let's keep the dialogue going in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching The Tea. Please remember to like and subscribe, and if you've made it this far, why not keep going and check out this episode?